How does Ferrari go from having one of its best race weekends to one of its worst in a matter of 2 races? Monaco was the dream for Ferrari and specifically Leclerc. Leclerc finishing P1 and Carlos Sainz finishing P3. The pace was phenomenal and the car was planted over the curbs and riding into the low and medium speed corners perfectly in Monaco. Canada is not too dissimilar of a track. It's got your low speed, it's got hard braking zones. The differences in track condition and weather really played a huge part in Ferrari struggling. If anything, it exposed the SF24's weakness and what the upgrades were supposed to come and fix on the car. The car has improved a lot, so has the strategy, but is this going to be a one-off, and will the Ferrari team make a comeback after a great start to a 2024 season? Before going into the big part of the video, I wanted to thank you guys for the support on the channel. We're almost at 48,000, and thank you for being a friend of the channel. To anyone that's a member, thank you so much for supporting. I always see you guys in the comments, and it means the world to me. But if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. It'd mean a lot to me. But let's get started into the Ferrari video. Strategy through the weekend is the first thing that I want to talk about. With Ferrari specifically, it seemed like everything was off. For a team that's been very on it, this was one of those weekends that they weren't on track with getting everything they needed to be done. The first thing that kind of bugged me was the team had no practice starts, meaning that by the end of FP1, 2, or 3, teams line up at the start-finish line and go for a practice start to get themselves warmed up for the race on Sunday. Obviously, with the tricky conditions, you want to know how to start the car and how much revs you need in the slippery weather to be able to get a great start. Neither Carlos nor Charles actually ended up having practice starts, and this is definitely attributed to a bad start in the beginning of the race that we just had. Qualifying was another story. We ended up seeing them both come out in Q2, but the car definitely wasn't slow for them to actually fall out in Q2. The potential for pace was there big time. Now, while the car didn't look like a pole position car, it was far from being P11 and 12. The team decided to run old softs towards the end of Q2, which gave them a lower chance at actually making it into Q3. We could see visibly on Charles that he definitely disagreed with the decision. Carlos didn't really make too much of a statement out of it, but an odd decision on a team that's been struggling through all the practice sessions and not really making a runway in the times that we saw through the weekend. So to make such a huge risk just to pay off for some softs that were probably not going to be run in the race was a bad strategy decision. Those strategy decisions then went on Sunday through the pit stops. We saw some weird pit stops. We saw Leclerc putting on hards. And while I do see what they were going for, they had pretty much nothing to lose. It was a weird decision to make on a track that nobody seemed to be taking that gamble, and Ferrari was one of the first after having their car running in pretty much P9 or 10, and they ended up actually fixing that engine issue later on in the race. So there was potential there for points both through Carlos and Leclerc if the strategy was set up a bit better from the team in red. The SF24 was definitely exposed here in Canada. We've seen a lot of strengths in the team, but this is where we saw the weaknesses really come out in that SF24, which is now the SF24 Evo. Leclerc's engine is the first thing that I want to point out. Now, this is not a weakness. This is just a reliability issue they had. He was pretty much losing about 0.6 on the straights, and he was definitely down. His speed with the DRS was a 306 with the engine problem. When there was no engine problem, no DRS, he had a 308 kph, which is a major difference in time and a big reason as to why he wasn't able to catch up to a lot of the people in front. He actually had a pretty much 7/10 pace on Lance Stroll when the engine problem was fixed. So he could have ended up catching the Aston Martin, maybe had potential to get up all the way to Fernando Alonso, but I don't think he had the pace of the McLarens or the Mercedes. The tires were not heating up. We've seen this be a problem for them continuously throughout the season, and the SF24 Evo was supposed to address these issues. The warm-up on the tire is not great, that hurts them in qualifying, but then in the race, the tire stays cold, they end up having no grip, and as Leclerc explained it, the more rain that falls, the less grip they have, but with less rain falling, then the engine issue was actually occurring as well. There were multiple problems plagued within this team, and where the Ferrari's strengths lie is in the low-speed corners. At least they had that in the SF23. They weren't able to use that because the grip wasn't there to start, with the tires not firing up and being in a bad temperature state. The temperature in those tires was never firing up to peak level to where Leclerc or Carlos could actually use the pace. Carlos does end up actually explaining in the race, while it was drying towards the end of it when they run that medium stint, he felt like he had a bit more pace to end up catching to the RB team. He ends up making that mistake. makes a spin. That's your double DNF there because Leclerc already ended up going out because he just didn't feel like it was worth running anymore in the race. After all the bad pit stops and just falling super far behind, actually getting lapped by Max Verstappen at some point. The two races where the Ferrari has really had those weaknesses is in Canada and China. So any track with the sea, you better avoid if you're a Ferrari fan. In China, the conditions were cold. We ended up actually seeing some rain as well. They weren't able to qualify as well as they wanted to, and they were super far off the pace. Part of the problem was the strategy. They ended up only going with the one stop, while teams like Red Bull and McLaren both went for 2 stops, and that ended up paying off better in the race. But that was never the team that was going to be on the podium, both in China and in Canada. The same problem occurred with the tires not being able to heat up, never getting in peak condition, and through the race they weren't actually able to use their amazing strength in the car, which is their tire degradation, and then being able to ride curbs as well. But with the tires being so cold and not being in the right condition, this team was never able to get its true pace out of the car. Is this a one-off? Will we see Ferrari struggle in any of the other races? Now, as I said, we saw this in China and Canada. That's clearly where the Ferrari car wasn't best, and McLaren was much better, and so was Red Bull. This was definitely one of those bad weekends that I don't think will happen to this degree again. It almost seems kind of like the weekend Red Bull just had in Monaco. Now, obviously, it's double DNFs, and Max still ended up finishing P6, but a P6 for Max is pretty much like a DNF. The upgrades have not been really performing yet, but we still have yet to see that peak window of these upgrades. Spain will be a better time to see this. Most teams are able to optimize and see what those upgrades are supposed to do. It's supposed to help them in slow speed cornering as well as firing up those tires, but we just haven't seen that yet. In Imola, the car ran pretty well. Monaco, we obviously saw that, but I felt like Monaco was going to be good whether the car was upgraded or not. And we still have yet to see new rear wings on this car to actually upgrade their straight line speed. They're still lacking in that development, but there is much more coming to that car, and we should expect some parts in Barcelona. There was no time to optimize this in a weekend where it's wet and dry. Most teams didn't bring too many big upgrades here. Aston had a little bit of something. Mercedes did obviously find some time as well. But the optimization for these upgrades could not happen, at least for Ferrari's case, through the free practice sessions because of the change of conditions consistently. The SF24 is better than the SF23 pretty much everywhere with the exception of straight line speed. But that's a sacrifice you gotta make to be better in slow speed, medium speed, and high speed. And I do believe in Barcelona, we're going to see a much stronger car. And this is where we'll actually see the car come alive. There are better tracks to come where Ferrari will be able to show off pace in these new upgrades and in general with the car. I expect more tracks where the Ferrari can actually show some pace off in comparison to what we just saw. Canada seemed like a one-off weekend. It could happen again, but they're definitely not having the same problems like a team like Aston Martin, who's falling back in the grid, but recently had a good weekend. We will not see these problems continue for Ferrari. I do believe this to be a one-off, but it has exposed something they definitely need to fix in the car, which is that tire grip that they cannot actually use in colder conditions. Kind of like the Mercedes, they both seem to have that problem reoccurring from Grand Prix to Grand Prix. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys did, give it a like and subscribe. It would mean the world for me. And comment down below. Let me hear your thoughts on what you think the SF24 is going through and Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. But please leave a like, subscribe, it would mean the world, and peace.